New Year's Eve night, that magical moment when everyone celebrates the arrival of the new year, might be the last place we imagine something terrifying happening. However, there are stories, accounts, and events that make us question whether time and space are truly what they seem. Instead of celebration and happiness, some people find themselves immersed in experiences that go beyond what can be explained. These are not invented stories, but real accounts from people like you and me who found themselves trapped by something far greater than simple superstitions. Each of these stories, in some way, shows us that terror isn't just in shadows or in the appearance of creatures that shouldn't exist. It's in what we can't see, in those things that often we'd rather not know exist. And if you think that New Year's is just a festive date, a simple change of calendar, get ready to understand what happens when something beyond our understanding takes over a night that should be like any other. You are about to embark on a journey through real and disturbing horror stories that happen on New Year's Eve. Stories that are not only terrifying, but mess with our perceptions of time, space, and perhaps even reality itself. So take a deep breath and get ready. What you're about to hear defies logical explanation, but it's something you might never forget. Asterisk story 1. The clock that never stopped. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, but things soon took a different turn. On New Year's Eve, a group of friends and I decided to spend the night in a secluded country house, far from the city. The house had an eerie atmosphere, but no one paid attention to the little details. The clock on the wall stopped exactly at 11:59 p.m., the lack of electricity, and the strange cold that invaded the place. We thought it was all part of the charm of the place, but we would soon discover that there was nothing charming about that house. The house had an old-fashioned decor and an air of desolation. The furniture was heavy and dark, with thick curtains that barely allowed the moonlight to enter. Soon, we began to settle in the large living room, with floors creaking beneath our feet and the fire in the fireplace crackling. The night was supposed to be fun, full of laughter and celebration, but a sense of unease began to linger in the air. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall was stopped, its hands frozen at a moment that wouldn't pass. I decided to ignore it, but an inexplicable cold seemed to invade the room, and it wasn't coming from the outside. The house seemed alive in some way, as if it were watching us. When I looked back at the clock, it was still frozen, exactly at 11:59 p.m. And then, as if something supernatural were happening, the lights in the room flickered, failing for a second before stabilizing. The clock, however, remained motionless. That night, as we prepared for the countdown to the new year, something unusual happened. The clock, which had been stopped for hours, suddenly started working. But it wasn't the usual ticking sound. It was deeper, louder. We all went to the main room, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation that was growing in the air. As we started the countdown, a strange presence seemed to manifest. The lights began to flicker, and for a moment, I thought someone was playing a prank on us. The sound of the clock seemed louder than usual, and the silence in the house was becoming unbearable. Then the clock stopped again, but not when the clock struck midnight. It stopped exactly when we were doing our final countdown. It was as if time had been frozen in the moment we were preparing to celebrate the turn of the year. The house went completely silent, and a chill ran down my spine. The fire in the fireplace abruptly ceased, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally. I knew something was wrong. I looked at my friends' faces, trying to find a rational explanation, but they all seemed just as scared as I was. What had happened to the electricity? Why did the clock, with its pulsing sound, seem to have stopped for a specific reason? I could never quite say for sure, but the atmosphere began to feel heavier, and each of us seemed to feel an increasing weight in the room. It was as if we were being watched, without knowing by whom or what. Then, without warning, the clock started working again. But this time, the sound was unbearable. A deep, low sound that reverberated in our bones. And suddenly, The house seemed to transform. The wood of the walls creaked. The wind outside intensified, and a strange pressure seemed to take over each of us. We tried to open the doors to leave, but something was stopping us. A feeling of helplessness took over. The sensation of being trapped in a loop, unable to escape whatever was there with us, was overwhelming. The countdown for the new year continued in our minds, but was no longer about the turning of the year. It was as if we were stuck in that moment, in suspended time, unable to move or change what was happening. It was reality distorting around us, with the clock being the only link between us and something much darker. And as the clock ticked endlessly, we began to understand that, in that place, time didn't behave as it should. The New Year's mirror, I had always been skeptical about horror stories. I believed that everything was just a product of imagination or exaggeration. But that was before the New Year's Eve night my wife and I spent at an old mountain hotel. The idea was simple. Escape the routine, enjoy the tranquility, and wait for the New Year's arrival in an isolated place, far from the city. What we didn't know was that night, something unexplained awaited us. The hotel, although beautiful and welcoming, had an uncomfortable aura. The hallways were dark and silent, and the furniture seemed older than expected. When we arrived, the receptionist led us to a room on the upper floor, away from the view of others. On the wall of the room was a large full-length mirror. I had a strange feeling when I looked at it. Something didn't seem right. It was as if it reflected more than just my image. As the hours passed, the sensation in the room worsened. The mirror, which had initially seemed like just a regular decorative item, now dominated the atmosphere of the room. The soft light from the lamp seemed to reflect in a distorted way on the glass, as if it absorbed something beyond the light. My wife, more perceptive, noticed that her reflection was slightly different, but I reassured her, saying it was just a tiredness and weak light. Time passed, and soon we were ready to celebrate the New Year's arrival. We played music, had some drinks, and suddenly the idea came up to do the countdown in front of the mirror as a joke. As we approached, something peculiar happened. The reflection in the mirror didn't seem to show us as we were. Instead, the image began to distort in an unusual way. The contours of our faces became blurred, and suddenly, the surroundings behind us seemed to disappear. The reflection of the room appeared to be replaced by darkness, as if another dimension existed inside that glass. I tried to ignore it, but my wife, visibly uncomfortable, suggested we leave the room and go to the balcony. When we turned to grab our things, the reflection in the mirror seemed to watch us in a way that couldn't be explained. Something was wrong. I approached the mirror, and for a moment, I could almost swear there was something or someone else there, as if a familiar face was there, but it wasn't mine. The sense of dread grew, but I was still trying to rationalize everything. But when I looked back at the mirror, everything seemed even more distorted. The edges of the image became sharper, and the surroundings around us seemed to disappear. The room was in complete darkness, except for the reflection, which seemed to emit a faint light, but a color I had never seen before. That reflection seemed to be trying to break free, as if the mirror were a prison for something that shouldn't be there. Before we could react, the clock on the wall, which had been stopped since our arrival, suddenly came to life. The hour was approaching, and the countdown for the new year was about to begin. But instead of celebrating, something sinister seemed to hang over us. The reflection in the mirror became more vivid, more real. It seemed like the mirror was drawing us in, as if it were inviting us to enter its darkness. I couldn't move anymore. The clock in the background began to count the seconds, but instead of following the rhythm of our reality, it seemed delayed, as if it were in another plane. Every second that passed became heavier. My wife's reflection now seemed to stare at me intensely. She was no longer herself. It was no longer my wife reflected there. It was something I didn't recognize, but I knew it was there with eyes fixed on me. And it was exactly at the turn of the year that the reflection completely transformed. I saw, without a shadow of a doubt, that we were no longer the two of us there. There was something strange, something distorted, reflected in the mirror. As we looked at ourselves, we realized that our bodies weren't moving the same way. The reflection was in discord with our real movements. And looking deeply into our own eyes in the mirror, I realized we were no longer the same people reflected there. Our faces were blurred and deformed, our eyes empty, as if something had replaced us, as if everything we were, our souls, were being consumed. The feeling of helplessness was indescribable. The mirror was pulling us into it, into a place I couldn't understand. We tried to move away, but something invisible was stopping us. I was paralyzed, watching the transformation of our reflections. They were watching us, but we were no longer there. There was something more, something ready to take our place. Fear took over me like a wave, and at that exact moment, the mirror seemed to be the only thing that stood between me and reality. The midnight echo, I was never very superstitious, and I always thought that the horror stories about New Year's were just myths. But an experience in a house that had once belonged to an old family completely changed my perception. It happened on a New Year's Eve when I decided to go alone to a retreat in a remote area. The house where I stayed was isolated, located at the top of a hill, surrounded by dense vegetation that seemed to hide secrets. I didn't know it at the time, but the night that approach would be an experience I would never forget. The house, although it seemed welcoming at first glance, had something strange. A musty smell in the air and the feeling that someone was watching me accompanied me from the moment I entered. The living room window was broken, and the wind made the sound of the curtains dragging across the floor. When night fell and the city lights disappeared behind the hills, I found myself surrounded by a heavy and oppressive silence, something I had never experienced before. And then the clock on the wall began to strike, as if it were waiting for something. Something was about to happen. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the fireplace that barely made a sound when I heard it for the first time. A whisper, very soft, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was the wind or some noise from the structure of the house, but the sound persisted like a distant echo, repeating something I couldn't understand. When I looked at the clock, I realized that the ticking of its pendulum was out of sync with the real time. The hour hand was about to strike midnight, but the sound of the clock seemed to be in a different beat, a deep, irregular tick that echoed in my head. I went to the kitchen, trying to distract myself, but the whisper continued, clearer now. Something was calling my name. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks, but an unsettling feeling began to take over me. My steps grew heavier, and as I approached the stairs, the sound of someone moving through the house became audible, as if the echo of time had begun to distort everything around me. But there was no one. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. As midnight approached, the atmosphere began to change. The house seemed to breathe, and time seemed to stretch. The clock, with its sharp and heavy sound, was ticking in a way that now seemed like a warning. I was trapped in the rhythm of something I couldn't control. The echo of the minutes passed like an invisible wave, and with every tick, a feeling of increasing pressure took over me. The fear of not knowing what would come at the turn of the year consumed me. I wanted to leave, but the door seemed locked. Something kept me there. The fear that the clock would imprison me in an endless cycle grew with every second. Then the last tick sounded. At midnight, everything went silent, and the house was immersed in absolute stillness. But it was at that exact moment that the echo of the clock transformed. The tick no longer came from the pendulum, but from inside my own head. It was as if time had merged with my perception, and suddenly I didn't know if I was living in the present or trapped in a moment that would never pass. The whisper, which had once seemed distant, was now in my mind, repeating words I didn't understand. I began to lose control of reality. With each tick of the clock, the echo deepened, and I found myself spiraling into distortion. The walls of the house seemed to close in. The temperature dropped, and the air grew denser. Something was happening there, but I couldn't explain it. The echoes of midnight were no longer just sounds, but a presence that infiltrated my mind, making me doubt everything around me. With every passing moment, I felt more lost, more trapped in something I couldn't understand. It was then that I realized the clock was no longer working. The sound of its ticks became increasingly frantic, as if it were trying to take me somewhere else. There was no space left for rationalization. The echo was consuming me, and in that instant, I realized that I was no longer the observer. I was inside the echo, trapped in the void of a night that would never end.